Welcome to the final module. This is going to begin our lecture on labor mobility. So it's going to be chapter 8 in your textbook. I'm going to skip some of the immigration from other countries, the sections on that, and focus on internal migration within the US. Um, I think this internal migration merits discussion, not just because of its importance for, the health of a functioning labor market, but also because people tend to have the exact opposite perception of reality. So what do you think the trend has been for people moving between states? Do you think it's higher or lower than it's been historically? I've heard from a lot of people in just, regular conversations that people move now more than ever before. We are more connected between states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, interstate mobility has fallen since we started tracking in World War II. So it's been a steady decline. And right before the pandemic, it reached its lowest level ever. Now, some of this can be intuitive. I moved from West Virginia to West Virginia from PA 3 years ago. And while I already had my job secured, so that was one less thing to worry about, it was still really a hassle to move. And, you know, it shouldn't be too surprising that people don't like to move. So we're going to look at when workers are willing to move from one state to another. So the ability for workers to move from one local labor market to another local labor market without any restrictions on that is fundamental to the idea of an efficiently functioning labor market. This idea dates back to Adam Smith in 1776 and his idea of the invisible hand. And it's one way in which our invisible hand in the labor market operates. And we talked about this in a previous chapter when we have workers in two markets, A and B. In market B, wages are really low. Market A, wages are really high. People will move from market B to market A, and it kind of equalizes the wages between those two labor markets. Milton Friedman also talks about this idea at length. Many people, when they think of Milton Friedman, they think of his political work. He had that show on TV, Free to Choose. You talk about tax policy or the military draft. But Friedman won the Nobel Prize, and he came up with a number of ideas used by economists of every sort of background and every school of thought. He wrote in a lot of different areas. One, I'm talking just about, the differences in local labor markets and moving between them and how that's important for a well-functioning labor market. So we're going to talk a little bit about this here, about why migration is so important from an economic standpoint. So firms in one region may have difficulty filling open positions. Without workers to fill those positions, consumers end up suffering either long wait times, inconvenient services, or higher prices. Something that my colleagues at the Knee Center work on is healthcare access, because there are a lot of areas without enough physicians or even without enough APRNs or RNs in order for patients to receive the care that they need. So one solution to a lack of healthcare providers is to encourage or at least minimize the barriers to those healthcare providers moving into these areas where they don't have enough. Make it easy for people to move. So you go from having, maybe there's a surplus in the city and there's none out in the countryside, where you have more people moving out or healthcare providers moving out to rural areas so the patients have access to healthcare. We see this all throughout the labor market as well, where firms in one location won't have enough workers nearby that have the skills that they need. And you can have other places where you have a lot of workers in an area, too many, some of them being employed or underemployed, working jobs that don't fully match their skills and training. So if they can move to the area of the shortage of professionals, where firms need to hire more workers, both the worker and the consumers in that area and the firm that they'd be hired by will all be made better off, economically speaking. So it's good for everyone. Of course, workers may want to stay near their family and friends, or they may want to stay put for any number of reasons, even if they can't find a job or if they're underemployed. So in this chapter, in this lecture, and the following lecture, I'm going to talk about migration from an economic standpoint, and we're going to consider the costs and benefits from an economic standpoint. Now, I've never moved more than 4 hours away from my parents and grandparents, and I really don't intend to. So in my personal life, I'm not maximizing GDP. I'm not trying, like, seeking to maximize economic efficiency or anything like that. I recognize that there's more to life, and we're going to generally talk about costs, but part of the cost is all these things from your personal life, all these additional hardships or awkward things or difficulties of moving, that these are going to enter in on the cost side. But our models are going to be simplified just so you can see how these variables interact. Now, if a destination has better economic prospects, people are more likely to move there. Now, moving can be a hassle. So the gains in wages not only have to exceed their current possibilities in their current location. So it's not just that the wage in the new home and the destination is, $1 per year greater than the wage that they're currently earning in their current location. It also has to exceed all the direct costs of moving and even all the indirect costs of living somewhere else. Now, I've done some work on the effect of occupational licensing laws on interstate migration because these are state level laws. When you move from one state to another, you don't automatically have that license. It's not as simple as transferring a driver's license. So there's this barrier to entry, this added cost of maybe the time and the hassle and even the money of applying for a new license. But there's a bunch of other costs besides these monetary costs that I talk about. So finding the new restaurants that you like, making friends, dealing with new traffic patterns in this city, new schools for your kids, them finding new friends. These are all burdens that people face for moving, even if we're not quantifying them into a simple, a dollar figure to compare. These are still real costs that we're facing. So if I'm going to move, the money and the job have to be good, or these hassles have to be minimized. And usually both. I need to make more money, but the amount of money I make has to exceed all of those hassles I'm going to face from moving. In general, people are going to consider these costs of moving with the potential benefits. So people will hesitate to move to Cambria County, Pennsylvania, where things aren't exactly booming, but they're more likely to move to a place like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Morgantown, where things are better and where they have, they're more likely to want to move there, to actually live there. The cost of moving from the current location is lower because they will enjoy living there more. Now, my cousin moved to France with his wife and their son a few years ago. I think it was supposed to be temporary at the time, but the pandemic hit a few months after they moved, and it suddenly became permanent. Now, she's from France. She grew up there. Her parents live there, and they live near her parents in the south of France. So not a bad deal if you ask me. Before they moved there, Tom knew some French from being married to a native French speaker, and he'd been there several times for holidays with her family, and her parents had come here a few times to see them. So he knew some people there too. And French culture is different from the US, definitely, but it's still Western. There's still a lot we have in common. So it's not that different in the grand scheme of things. He started working remotely for his job and then began working for a French university over there. So when people are considering move to a new place, they think about a lot. Of course, they think about money, but there are a lot of other costs to consider. So moving to a new country is more difficult than moving to a new state. So you're going over, they may speak an entirely different language. You're going distance-wise very far from where you live. Besides the language, totally different jobs, different culture. There's a lot of different things you have to deal with, and all these costs add up. So my cousin had a relatively easy move compared to most international moves. With different languages, cultures, long distances, these things can be extremely costly. And hopefully by now, from this class, you realize that when costs increase, it decreases the likelihood of doing something. So in this case, when moving becomes more costly or more difficult, it decreases the likelihood of moving. So intuitively, people think to themselves, will my job, will my career prospects be better in this new place? And how difficult will it be to move there? Both of those sides are considerations, the costs and the benefits. Even if you're not sitting down and writing out like a little cost benefit analysis thing or a pro and cons list, you're still thinking about both of these things, these potential benefits and these potential costs. Now, this should be a familiar refrain for you by now in this course. I keep repeating this over and over again. These are some of the simple tools of economics that we apply time and time again. Now, more educated workers are more likely to move. Jobs that require greater human capital are more likely to have difficulty filling positions because fewer people can do these jobs, and opportunities for training and experience may be limited in the surrounding area. Plus, these jobs pay more, so people with those careers are more likely to move for them. Again, it can be costly to move, so you need even higher salaries, like an even bigger difference from your current job if you're going to move, especially if it turns out to be a far move. Now, a long time ago, people with low education used to move quite a bit too, and this was to find opportunity. But that was slightly different. Think of stories like The Grapes of Wrath, of people leaving the Dust Bowl and heading west in hopes of finding something. Today, fewer people do that with just hopes of getting somewhere and, okay, now I'm going to find a job. Typically, it's trying to get a job lined up before you move. People will move for the job more often than they will say, hey, I want to go to the city, and then look for a job once they get there. Now, young people are also more likely to move to a new state. So think for a second, why might this be the case? These are kind of things you don't need economic theory to tell you why a young person might not want to do this. When you're young, you're often single, or even if you aren't single, you don't have kids yet, or at least they're not in school. So in many cases, you haven't built up a community yet, and your job isn't as high paying. So in general, it's just less costly to pick up and move to opportunity. So here's the economic theory, the very basic one. Again, we're considering costs and the benefits. When the cost is lower when you're younger, moves become more attractive. So you're more likely to move. And that's what we see is the younger people are more likely to move. People that are in their mid 20s, their early 30s, they're a higher percentage of them are willing to move. You see on this figure here, compared to people as they get older, look at them in their 50s and their 60s, down to 1% from almost 4% in their mid 20s. Now, family migration becomes more difficult. So for young people, when they're single, it's easy for them to move. They only have to worry about really themselves, what makes sense for them given their career and the costs that they're facing. Of course, some of those costs might involve friends or family members, but these friends or family members won't be actually moving with them. For family migration, we're talking about the whole family unit moving. That is much more difficult. And I don't think you need an economist to tell you that, but we're going to think about it using the tools of economics. So instead of considering what is the optimal decision for the individual worker, when we're talking about the idea of family migration, you have to consider the optimal decision for the whole family unit. So this involves everyone in the family, whether they're working or not. And these can be drastically different. So imagine the traditional 1950s family with a working husband, a wife that's a homemaker, and 5 kids, few in school, like 3 or 4 in school, and like 1 or 2 still at home. So the husband may have been able to improve his job by moving, but he has to consider the whole family. So in this case, new schools for the kids, new social network, maybe there's no extended family where they're thinking about moving. These are costs for the rest of the family that they have to take, that they have to face and consider. Now, that was hard enough back then if you had this stereotypical one income earner, because you have to consider other people actually making the move with you. But today the decision can be even more difficult. So this idea called the two-body problem, that you have not just 2 people looking to make the move, but if you have 2 people working, you have to consider both careers. So when both spouses work, and let's say one has the option to move for work, you don't just think about the cost to the family in general, the difficulty of moving, of picking up your life and starting all over again. You have to consider both careers as well. So this complicates the decision a little bit. Not just as a complicated decision, it also increases the potential costs of moving. It changes the potential benefits, but it pretty much guarantees to increase the cost of moving. Now, if one spouse works a job that is that's needed everywhere across the country, think of something like an RN, right? People need healthcare everywhere. That's great. It makes it much easier if the other spouse's career needs them to move or provides an opportunity to move. But many other jobs are not so flexible. So you get one of 2 things happening. In one case, the first party forgoes moving to a better job because their spouse's job prospects are that much worse than their destination. Sure, they can get a job and they can increase their salary, maybe save by $5,000. But if their spouse would really struggle to find a job and they're in this new location, if they can't enter their field, or maybe they do find a job in their field, but it's not quite a good fit and ends up paying, say, $10,000 less, the family ends up worse off. So this is called a tied stare, where because you have the 2 individuals, the one that is considering moving is tied to that original location. They stay because they're tied to their spouse and their spouse's job. The other option is the family does make the move. The first spouse's job is that much better than the others, so they end up deciding to move to this new location, and that spouse begins working there. But the other spouse ends up unemployed or underemployed in their new destination. So we call this a tied mover, where this person goes along with the move, the spouse goes along, but their career prospects end up suffering. So even today, it tends to be the husband. So more often, it's the husband who makes the decision to move, and the wife that's the trailing spouse. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, but in general, the husband's job tends to be less flexible. Again, I'm saying in general, and the wife's more flexible. There are many female-dominated jobs spread throughout the country. So think about things like healthcare, like nursing, teachers. These jobs have locations all across the country. So it makes it a lot easier for someone in those professions to get a job in the new location and to move along. Again, like I said, it's not always the case, but more often than not nowadays, in general, that's the way it tends to be. Although we see that especially over, I forget, Janet Johnson has some good work on this, and I think within like the past 10 years, we've seen a considerable change in these trends. Now, your textbook includes some equations to show the relationship between a husband's and a, oh, excuse me, yeah, between a husband and a wife's net present value from moving or staying put. They're considering this whole family dynamic. So to save you some trouble, I'm going to skip ahead. Instead of focusing on the math, we'll just show this visually. It's what we already talked about, but it's a good idea to see how this works out. So we have a graph that makes it easy to see the gain for the husband or for the wife, depending on which one of them moves and the options that they have before them. For the time being, we're ignoring the possibility of children or any of the costs associated with raising kids. So we're just going to focus on the husband and the wife's career, not even any of their broader family or friends or any of those sorts of costs. So if we look from the top to the bottom on this graph, we see the husband's gains. So as we go up here, from down here up to there, the gains are greater. Down here, they're negative. Once we hit this line here, we hit 0, so it's neutral for the husband. And anything above there is positive. So there's no difference from going left to right. So this point Y here at 10,000, whether you go over here or even over here at 10,000, for the husband, that's all the same. We only care about going up and down. So going left to right here is the wife's gain. So going from side to side here. Down here, it's at its lowest, negative 10,000. Up here, this vertical line is 0 for her. And then going further on this side increases her gains in a positive direction. So she'll choose, if she's offered these points, any of these A, B, C, D, E, and F, she'll choose C, D, or E. All of these 3 points are above her 0 line. So if she is single, she's by herself, not thinking about her husband, any of those job offers are great for her. So she would move to them or gain over her current job. Now, the husband, if he's totally single, again, not considering his wife, would choose A, B, or C. All of these are above the 0 line for him. So he'd be happy to move because he's gaining from this move. But when they're both married, they have to consider the total payout, not just the benefit for them as an individual from that standpoint. So point A, down here, the husband would move if he was single. He has a slight gain of maybe $5,000. But look at the wife. At point A, she loses. This is her 0 line. So down here, she loses more than $10,000. So if you combine them together, add up his gain and her loss, they end up worse off if they move. So together, they would end up not moving. They would decide not to move. Likewise, looking at the wife, at point E right here, she would gain, again, maybe $4,000. That's her private gain from moving and taking this new job. But the husband, again, would lose over $10,000. So when you consider her gain and his loss, they'd be made worse off overall. So again, they would not move at point E. At point F down here, neither would move for that job because they're both worse off. So the family's only going to decide to move if the sum of the gains are greater than 0. So that's anywhere to the right of this diagonal line here in blue. So anywhere in this area, the family would move. So if offered a job at point B, the husband would take this job. It makes him a lot better off, and it makes the wife a little bit worse off for her career, but only a little bit worse off while he's much better off. It ends up being a positive payout, so they'll end up moving in this situation. Similarly, at point D, we see the opposite thing. So the wife here is the one who benefits, has a large benefit from this move, and the husband has a small negative effect. Her gains are greater than his losses, so they'll end up making this move as well. Now, point C, this is a great option. Both the husband and the wife gain a little under $10,000. Both of them are being made better off by this move. This would be like a couple moving to, say, Washington, D.C. A lot of A lot of people with PhDs move down there because normally one works for one of the universities around there, the other one ends up getting a job in the government. They both end up with really good jobs. So this is a lot of looking at a graph just to say, well, we intuitively already know, no, we've already talked about on previous slides that once a couple is married, their decision to move is going to be different from when they're single. When they're single, they're only thinking about the costs and the benefits to themselves. When they're married, they have to think about this jointly. So it's not just about the wife's salary and the increase that she can get from the move. It's also about her husband's and vice versa. It could be the husband has to be concerned about his wife now too. All right, so I'm going to end the lecture here and we will pick up with the next type of labor mobility in the next lecture.